Hello, and welcome to Project 2025, A Warning. I'm Molly Jong-Fast, a writer, a podcaster, and a person you occasionally see on cable news. And today, I'm talking to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, the junior senator from Rhode Island. If you know anything about my man, Sheldon Whitehouse, you know he's committed to climate justice. He is committed to reforming the judiciary. And he is the perfect person to talk about the implications of Project 2025 with. But before we start that conversation, let's get you up to speed. Last year, the influential right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, unveiled Project 2025. It is a roadmap for what another Trump administration would look like. It instructs independent agencies or agencies that would have been independent under other administrations, such as the Department of Justice, to be placed under direct presidential control. This basically gives the president a lot more power than a president has ever had before. And I know right now you may be thinking that this sounds a little crazy, like something one of your friends who reads a little too much Facebook sends you. But the Heritage Foundation developed and then linked the Project 2025 mission statement right from their website. The plan is titled Mandate for Leadership 2025, the Conservative Promise. They are not trying to hide it. In fact, they go on television and brag about it. And what they brag about is a plan to reshape America into the craziest conservative dystopia possible. Heritage and their allies have called for ending no-fault divorce, ending the Affordable Care Act, additional tax breaks for corporations and the 1%, a complete ban on abortions, cuts to Social Security, the end of climate protections, cutting Medicare, defunding the FBI and Homeland Security, banning sexual orientation and gender identity education, strictly limiting contraceptives and regulating in vitro fertilization, banning pornography and imprisoning anyone who disobeys, banning Muslims from entering the country, elimination of union and worker protections, raising the retirement age, raising prescription drug prices, eliminating the Department of Education, banning African American and gender studies at all levels of education, banning books and curriculum about slavery, use of the military to break up domestic protests, ending birthright citizenship, eliminating federal agencies like the FDA, EPA, and NOAA. And despite how crazy that sounds, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Now, you may be thinking, the Heritage Foundation isn't Donald Trump. It isn't his presidential campaign or the Republican Party. But the Heritage Foundation has been the laboratory for many of the conservative policies of the last half century. But don't take my word for it. Here's Senator Marco Rubio from the state of Florida.
And it's good to see you, and thank you to Heritage for inviting us here, giving us this opportunity, and for all the scholarship that they do here that really serves as a guidepost for a lot of the public policy we choose to make.
These policies are wildly unpopular, and Trump has tried to cover up his ties to them, namely Russ Vought and John McEntee. Let's discuss these guys. Christian nationalist Russ Vought, an author of Project 2025, serves as the policy director of the Republican Party Platform Writing Committee for the RNC. You know, the organization that Trump's daughter-in-law runs that pays many of his legal fees. And you may remember right-wing dating app entrepreneur John McEntee, who was Trump's body man and nicknamed Deputy President, joined Project 2025 to write the database for who the Trump administration should hire. And Trump's own insiders say he will be a big part of the next Trump administration. But a clear sign of Trump's tether to Project 2025 is that Trump's name appears in the document 312 times. They are indeed one in the same. And if you don't take this seriously, here's Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, and he's going to show you just how serious they are.
We are going to win. We're in the process of taking this country back. No one in the audience should be despairing. No one should be discouraged. We ought to be really encouraged by what happened yesterday. And in spite of all of the injustice, which of course friends and audience of this show, of our friend Steve know, we are going to prevail.
Well, that sounds threatening.
We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
I'm starting to think that these people may actually be very serious about making this happen. Kevin Roberts also said that he saw Heritage's role as institutionalizing Trumpism, adding that the Trump administration, with the best of intentions, simply got off to a slow start. Heritage and its allies in Project 2025 believe that that slow start should never be repeated. So now that we've established this is the backbone of what a second Trump term will look like, let's bring in in the brilliant Senator Sheldon Whitehouse to talk about what Project 2025 means for the judiciary and for climate change. Welcome, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. When I said we have to do this quick little YouTube series on Project 2025, I said the only United States senator that we could possibly have who I'm sure is ready for this is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
We do watch these rascals.
When you saw this, what was your take? Because it is all the things that I feel like it's an intersection of all the things that you are obsessed with as a politician.
Yep, it brings the long history of far-right billionaires trying to meddle in our politics, together with the dark money apparatus that the Koch brothers specialized in creating after Citizens United, now rebooted in MAGA format, I think probably to kind of nudge the Koch brothers operation out of the Republican political space and take it over with MAGA Trump people.
Is that because the Koch brothers were not right-wing enough, or is it because, like ideologically, the Koch brothers got what they wanted when it came to the Supreme Court, right?
Oh, without a doubt. In fact, we could have a whole separate show on exactly what went on. I'll take 2 minutes and say it's my theory that the war that existed in the early days of that campaign between House of Koch and House of Trump was brought to a negotiated conclusion, probably by Leonard Leo and Don McGahn, with the deal that the Kochs would get his Supreme Court appointments and they'd stop kicking him in the head and there would be peace. And then sure enough, there was peace. But of course, if you're the Kochs, you don't trust Trump further than you can throw him. So he has to do something public to confirm the deal. And he can't confirm the deal. So what they do is they come up with what they call the Federalist Society list, which the Federalist Society never considered, never had an agenda item, never had a vote. It was called that, but it was cooked up by somebody else other than the Federalist Society. And I think the result was that the Koch brothers actually, and their operation actually selected the appointments, and Trump went along with it, and McGahn went into his counsel's office to enforce the deal. And Leonard Leo was, of course, the fixer for the billionaires in all of this. So ultimately, I think there's more to find out about how all that took place, but it's that same dark money, smelly, billionaire-funded operation that is now rearing its head through Project 2025.
It makes so much sense, that theory, because if you think about Gorsuch and Amy Coney, and I think Amy was a later ad, right? But if you look at Gorsuch and you look at Kavanaugh, those are like Koch brothers' dream picks.
Absolutely.
They believe that corporations are people. With the exception of Gorsuch's weird Native American thing. And what I think is I'm so struck by, and then we'll get back to 2025 on the judiciary, is that they do seem completely focused on dismantling the administrative state.
Yes, because the billionaires are also almost inevitably polluters. And the fossil fuel industry has huge stakes in all of this and unlimited money to spend to defend a subsidy that in the last year, the International Monetary Fund identified at $700+ billion a year in the United States. So they are playing for very, very high stakes, and they can piddle away $1 billion here and $1 billion there, which makes a big difference in politics. But in terms of their finances and their fiscal well-being, it's pennies on the dollar. So they can play very, very hard, and they can play with a lot of dark money, and they can create an entire dark money ecosystem to try to come up with what are essentially cockamamie theories, but they all point to degrading the administrative state, so-called, that does things like, regulate pollution from our facilities.
Right. And that's the Chevron doctrine.
That's part of it. There was the major questions doctrine that emerged from the West Virginia versus EPA case. It was the stunt that they pulled to shut off the Obama Clean Power Plan, which probably was worth, $20 20, 30, 40 billion dollars to the fossil fuel industry over time. So they've already got their money back on what they spent in politics.
So let's keep going with Project 2025. Project 2025 has a plan for federal employees, and it's to fire them all.
Yep, they want to go back to before there was a civil service. They want to not only cripple administrative agencies that protect our health, safety, and welfare, but even more deeply drive out the expertise that the administrative agencies develop over many years and over lots of interaction with the regulated industries. They know what their tricks are. They know what the facts really are. They're hard because they understand chemistry and atmospheric science and whatever it is that's at issue. And if you could drive them all out and put in just a bunch of friendly knuckleheads, then it's totally easy to roll the administrative agency with your BS assertions through the Administrative Procedures Act process, your comments and your statements and all of that, because there's nobody calling BS on you who has the expertise to know that to identify your BS.
Yeah. And then there is a plan for the judiciary, right?
Well, that kind of is already underway. I mean, this sort of continues it, but, they have basically used the Federalist Society for the lower courts and the billionaire list that was not the Federalist Societies for the Supreme Court. They can basically ram almost anybody through because the same dark money billionaires that are behind packing the courts are also funding the big Republican Senate dark money political operation. So they can go to Mitch McConnell and say, dude, we've given you $50 million. We've given you $80 million. Don't screw us on this. You guys are all going to have to swallow hard and vote for a guy with pending questions about whether he committed a drunken sexual assault. You're going to have to vote exactly 180 degrees opposite about what you said about voting on judicial nominees in the year before an election. It just doesn't matter because the prevailing driver here is the political money upon which they depend.
When we talk about this sort of the pay for play aspect, how did this happen? I mean, it was the Supreme Court, Citizens United. How did we get here?
We got here slowly but surely. It began with a report to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce decades ago by a gentleman named Lewis Powell, who wrote a strategy memo for how corporate America could take back the power they felt that they'd lost through the women's rights movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, all of that. 6 months after giving the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that report, he was on the United States Supreme Court, and he started writing decisions that incrementally allowed corporations into the American political election effort. And the culmination of all that, the huge, sockdolager of a victory, was Citizens United that allowed corporate entities to spend unlimited amounts of money in politics and instantly became anonymous, unlimited corporate and special interest money in politics. So now you have these huge resources available that show up, say, in a super PAC with $70 million. And you don't know who put the money into the super PAC. All you have to do is launder it through one entity on the way to the super PAC, and you've hidden your identity. So that has really made special interests immensely powerful. They can go again to Mitch McConnell or to the speaker, and they can say, hey, look, we can give you unlimited amounts of money for your super PACs. You can beat the hell out of the Democrats. They'll never know it's us, but you got to do what we tell you. And obviously the kind of people who can play at that level are very few, very politically motivated, and obviously by definition eager to do evil in the American democracy to get their way.
So there is only one Koch brother now.
Or at least one of the political ones.
Right. Who else are the sort of big donors on the GOP side here that we should know?
Well, there are a lot of big fossil fuel donors, and not necessarily, Exxon and Shell and Chevron, although I'm sure they're very active. It's hard to tell because of the dark money stuff. But a lot of it comes from also people who've made huge amounts of money in the drilling and wildcatting and refining and other aspects of the oil business. The Koch brothers actually, I don't think, drill oil at all. They just refine it into products. So their fossil fuel fortune comes a little bit down the supply chain from from others. The Mercers have been very active. There are, unfortunately, quite a few right-wing billionaires who make a lot of money and feel that that entitles them to run the show. What did Bruce Springsteen say? Poor man want to be rich, rich man want to be king.
Let's get back to Project 2025. Some of the central tenets here, besides dismantling the administrative state and getting rid of professionals in places that you shouldn't have amateurs, is that you will have a certain, like every arm of the federal government will ultimately work for the Trump administration and theoretically for the Trump campaign too, right?
Yeah, I don't think the Hatch Act, for instance, that tries to separate career employees who are doing their work for the American people from the campaign side who are just trying to get one guy elected. I don't think that wall will last very long. All it takes is one attorney general to say, I don't think it's constitutional to have that division. So we're not going to prosecute Hatch Act violations anymore. And all of our ethics people are going to stand down on the Hatch Act. And everybody is now a campaign volunteer for Trump. And if you don't show up, then consider yourself fired.
I mean, there is in the works right now plans to try to fight this Project 2025. Can you talk to us about what that looks like?
Yeah, I think, a lot of it has to do with trying to figure out who is all behind it and to take on the operation that through which it's being implemented. You've got the actual Project 2025 operation that is taking place as they develop the policy manuals and all of that. And then you've got the creepy right-wing billionaires who are behind all the funding of it, but there are all these intermediary elements. And I think the more we dig into those, the more the American public's going to be a little bit scandalized at what a self-dealing and corrupt operation this is. So, for instance, they've got this, CPI, conservative, what do they call it? Conservative Partnership Institute that actually has 501c3 status as if it was a charitable entity.
How is that possible?
It's possible because you have to go back a bit. After Citizens United, the way that the big special interests got to do dark money spending, the way they got to hide who they were and anonymize their funding, was to run it through entities established under the tax code called 501c4 entities. They had to pay a big premium because a 501c4 entity could only spend half its money on politics, but they wanted political secret influence so badly, they were happy to pay 100% premium, basically, to get that other 50% out into politics. And then the IRS noticed that there was all this political work being done by groups that aren't supposed to be political, and there was very little accountability. So they started looking at them, and the hue and cry went up from the right-wing faux outrage machine, and they beat the hell out of the IRS commissioner and repeatedly threatened to impeach him, and they sent his associate over to the Department of Justice with a criminal referral for prosecution, and they cranked up all their phony baloney media outlets to be doing a lot of yelling and screaming. And sadly, the Obama administration rolled over and said, yeah, you're right, this is all pretty bad, and the IRS shouldn't be involved in this stuff, missing a huge teachable moment. But the teachable moment that resulted was for the IRS, which is don't enforce with 501c3s or 501c4s. You will get the crap kicked out of you. Nobody will have your back. And so they've been in a fetal position ever since. You can cheat a lot around 501c3 and 501c4 rules without fearing that the sheriff who's hiding under the desk back in his locked office will ever come out and actually take a look at what you're up to. So Conservative Partnership Institute does nothing for anybody except Republican side folks. And that should be a pretty flagrant 501c3 violation, but nobody will look. So they get away with it. And basically, it's like the motorcycle gang rolled into town and the sheriff has gone to hide under the desk, and they know that they can get away with whatever they want, so they're playing outside the rules.
Hi. I just want to stop for 1 second. The reason we put this on YouTube for free is because we wanted to spread it to as many people as possible. It would really help us if you comment, click like, and send this to a friend or 3. Also, if you enjoyed this, subscribe to our podcast, Fast Politics, on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much. Now back to the interview. So crazy. So Talk to us about what the sort of like fix is, the solve is for Project 2025. Like, what can you do now? For example, there were certain things that the Senate passed, like the Electoral Count Vote Act. As much as I love to complain about the lack of government regulation, you guys did actually do a couple of really smart things that you learned from 2020 that you made sure to get in there. Can you talk about what they were and how they could be expanded to stop Project 2025?
They mostly help in the space of how do you fend off an attack on the election process. And a lot of the tricks that they tried to pull, the Congress fixed. But you could still end up, for instance, with a situation in which an election gets thrown into the Congress, to the House of Representatives to be determined. And then it gets determined for the Republicans because it's vote by state, not by members. And all the little Republican states out west, they pile up a lot of states pretty fast compared to New York, California, and so forth. So they basically would automatically win. So there's still ways to try to maneuver towards an automatic win and get around the voters. There's also, I think, the Disclose Act is very important so that Americans can see who's funding their politicians.
Right. Can you explain what that is?
Basically, the Supreme Court said, we're going to allow unlimited amounts of money in politics in Citizens United because it's all going to be transparent. So the voters are never going to be fooled, and they'll know who's spending the money, and they can take that into account. Well, of course, that wasn't true. They went running off into the 501c4s, and the Supreme Court has tellingly never bothered to enforce that supposed part of its decision. So now you've got all this enormous amount of money coming through, but under the Supreme Court's decision, Congress can regulate that. We could require disclosure because the Supreme Court actually said there would be disclosure. So we have a bill to do that, over $10,000 in a race, and you've got to disclose who you are, and not just the first level of the Russian nesting doll. You got to go all the way back to the true beneficial owner. So if you applied that, it would take away the ability of a billionaire to run, let's say, $100 million through Donors Trust into a 501c4 and onto a super PAC without anybody knowing ever who that billionaire was. You'd actually have the ability to track back any money spent in elections to the real, actual, true donor. So that would be, I think, a really big thing to get accomplished. And then, frankly, to have the IRS get back up on its, feet and dust itself off and start investigating 501c3 and 501c4 mischief and make referrals to the Department of Justice, which has the ability to actually prosecute fraud and false statements and things like that. But that whole apparatus of governance, that whole IRS investigative and enforcement piece, and the lead over to the Department of Justice for prosecution, that whole thing has completely collapsed and dried up and blown away.
That's really grim. Can you talk to us about climate and sort of where we are right now? Florida is underwater. They can't get insurance. I mean, like, if we had a little more climate-centered mainstream media, I mean, you look at Florida, that is a climate disaster happening right in front of us.
Right in front of our eyes, in plain view. And in the Budget Committee, which I've tasked to work on climate economic risk, because we've had testimony that the 2008 financial meltdown, which added trillions and trillions of dollars to our debt, is a preview of a worse financial meltdown coming from climate change when you can't get insurance on properties any longer because the insurance companies can't predict whether it's in wildfire areas or coastal areas. When the insurance market collapses for homes in those areas, then the mortgage market collapses for homes in those areas because without insurance, you can't get a mortgage. And with no mortgage market in those areas, that means the only people who can buy are millionaires and billionaires who can pay cash. That's not enough people to support supply and demand. So then you get a property values crash. And we have multiple witnesses warn that this is coming on. And of course, the Republicans are They just don't want to hear it. One other fact that your listeners should know is that back when I got to the Senate, we were doing bipartisan climate work all the time. John McCain carried the Republican banner into the presidential race with a terrific climate platform. Citizens United, January of 2010, killed all bipartisanship on climate, and it has never revived since. Only on eensy-teensy little bills that make no real difference.
Because the oil companies had too much power then.
Bingo. They stepped up. They were the first ones to take advantage of the unlimited money and of the 501c4 secrecy. And they went into the Republicans and said, hey, guys, look what we can do now to help you. We can crush the Democrats. We can bomb them with negative advertising a year ahead of the election, which they did. But if you want that kind of money, if you want that kind of bombardment to support you, you're going to have to tell all your Republicans to knock it off on climate change. That has to become a partisan issue. And the Republicans rolled over and happily said yes and took the money and went to work keeping Mitch McConnell in the driver's seat in the Senate.
Pulling this back to Project 2025, Trump did say to oil company executives that if they gave him $1 billion, can you talk about that? It was like being in the mafia, right?
Yeah, I think in prosecution land, what is left of political corruption prosecutions after the Supreme Court has whittled it down to a tiny little nub, but what is left at that tiny little nub that still remains is a direct quid pro quo, this for that solicitation. And so here he goes into this private meeting with all fossil fuel industry executives, and he says, here are all the things I'll do, but you got to give me $1 billion. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty appalling that he would be so bold about all of this, so brazen. But also we have a Department of Justice right now that is not exactly the most roistering and boisterous of all, let's just say.
What happened over there?
I don't know. Years ago, the Department of Justice was willing to take on the tobacco industry, which was then a massive American industry with a huge political and public relations and lobbying operation. And they brought a lawsuit saying, hey, you know what you're saying about your product? That's actually not true. That's actually fraud. You are defrauding the American people with fake news about the safety of your product, which is exactly what the fossil fuel industry has been doing for decades also. In fact, the fossil fuel industry actually took over some of the tobacco front groups when they switched over. So the Department of Justice won that case against tobacco. It was a crushing victory. And they got an order saying, thou shalt lie no more. And it changed the whole trajectory of the tobacco industry and the whole trajectory of American smoking. And this Department of Justice won't even do the due diligence to find out if such a case is justified. It's frustrating that they don't want to do that.
Is that Merrick Garland or Lisa Monaco and by the way, I might add, these are people who Donald Trump has promised to lock up. It's not, he will probably lock us up too, but Merrick Garland is definitely going to be in Gitmo before we are. You would think even just for self-protection matters, he might take a little interest in this.
I think he needs to make his decisions on the merits the way all attorneys general do. But I think this decision is one where they're not actually bothering to look at the merits. For some reason, they've just decided that this is a case they're not interested in. I badger them saying, look, if you've got a cop on the street standing down at the corner and you walk by a smashed store window and you see goods missing from the store window display, you've got every right to go and tell the cop, hey, go look down the street at the broken window at the missing goods. And if the cop refuses to walk down the street, you have every right to badger the cop about it. You're not trying to take over the investigation. You're not trying to interfere in the investigation. You're just saying, would you please go have a look? And that's what we're trying to do with the Department of Justice, to say, at least have a look and see if this meets the tobacco case standards that led to a thumping victory for the Department of Justice that had important public health and safety consequences. It's one of the biggest things the department has ever done to save lives.
Yeah, and it's also the same. It's funny because it's like tobacco, oil, guns, and social media, right? The reality is social media uses content that is not verified to pipe fake news into American households. I mean, is there some regulation that could, if you guys were miraculously able to win the trifecta, that could make tech companies support local news so that we would have some content that was real and verified?
One very important thing that we could do is to repeal what is called Section 230, which is an old provision back when these tech companies were developing in people's garages that treated them basically as like a community notice board, and you can't be held accountable because somebody pins a dirty picture on the community notice board. But they've changed well beyond that. They've got these complicated algorithms that are controlling the feed, and regular courtrooms and regular jurors ought to have a right to review what they've done and apply the exact same law that applies to newspapers and other information providers, book publishers, etc. They should not be exempt from all of that. And if you look around, there have been some really good wins. Look at what happened with Jean Carroll and Donald Trump, right? He was going to bury her in bullying forever, but she got into an honest courtroom and she got a big judgment against him. Look at what happened to InfoWars, that creep Alex Jones, who was pretending that the Sandy Hook moms had made up the massacre of their children. And he was going to continue to bury them in bullying, except that an honest courtroom now has him reeling from the judgment against him. And ditto with Dominion and the mightiest propaganda outlet on the planet, Fox News. $800 million in a judgment against him. So, that's the last part of the American system, the jury system, the honest courtroom that is really working and working still. And the more we can empower that, I think the better off we are.
Right now, as we talk about this Project 2025, is there anything that people can do who are watching this, who are freaked out by the idea that they're going to regulate IVF, they're going to try to take away birth control pills, there's just so much craziness in there. Give us a little hope.
I think if you look behind the climate denial operation, you find dark money. If you look behind the operation that captured the Supreme Court and turned it into a tool of the right-wing billionaires, you find dark money. And the dark money operation is now very widespread in politics. You look behind creepy super PACs, and there's dark money controlling voters through news that is not leavened by knowing who the source is. So I think that the evil that makes so many other evils possible is the enormous power of huge special interests and creepy right-wing billionaires to hide who they are and meddle in politics in ways that A, make them a fortune. They're not doing this just ideologically. They are making big money off of this. And B, to accomplish what they could not accomplish through regular democracy and democratic processes. So to me, dark money is the root of all these evils. And the sooner we can rid our politics of it and figure out who's behind 501c3s and 501c4s and all of that, the better off we'll be. That puts citizens back in charge of their democracy. They're no longer being fed nonsense by people they can't even identify. And I think that'll make for a much better America, a much better democracy. The pressure will come down when people aren't being bombarded in their TVs by groups that they know are phony. Nobody ever bought a product from Americans for Peace and Puppies and Prosperity, or whatever the hell these groups are called.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse.
Great to be with you. Thank you for your relentlessness in trying to rebuild our democracy.
Thank you so much for watching this episode. We made this series so that you can educate others in your life about the very real threat to America that Trump's second term would pose. Project 2025 will remake the federal government. And it's really important that you share this with a friend. Click like on the video and comment so it spreads to more people on YouTube. If you want more interviews like this, subscribe to Fast Politics on your favorite podcast app.
Heritage
Thanks
and
for
their allies
watching.
have called for.